Tiny Podcast Bicentennial Special. I'm your host, Ryan Ward, and today we have with us Steve Penney, who's done research into the Native Americans of the southern New England area. Thank you, Steve, for being here.
Thank you, Ryan. My pleasure.
So, how did you get into studying the Native Americans of this area?
Well, in a moment of insanity some years ago now, I thought I might want to write the next history of Manchester.
Wow, okay.
For this year.
Okay.
So this was probably 5-7 years ago. And if I was really lucky, I would con the state historian not the state historian, the town historian.
Yes.
To assist me in that effort and to be a co-author. Susan Barlow, of course.
Yeah.
But I got bogged down in the Indians.
Oh, okay.
So I never got that far. So I started with the Manchester Historical Society, and I did a presentation with slides to them about the Indians, and other local historical societies were interested. So I did it probably 6 or 8 times.
Wow.
Mostly to historical societies. But other
societies.
groups. There's a group that calls itself the Descendants of the Founders of Ancient Windsor. And I did their annual meeting one year.
Interesting.
And they're all people that, are related to the first settlers of Windsor.
Interesting.
So that was fun.
So how did you find those, going to these different, historical societies and sharing this information? How did you find that experience?
Well, people are really interested in the Indians, which I guess comes as no surprise. And they don't know much of anything about them. It's hard to find the material, and you have to put a lot of effort into it and read multiple sources. So, I think I got more or less the picture of things, and we'll find out.
Yeah, we will.
In the next hour or so.
Yeah. So how did this start for you? How did it develop? You said that you got stuck on the Indians. You got stuck there. How did that happen?
Well,
what kind of grabbed
my
you?
own interest grew.
Yeah.
Again, because of, to some degree, of the reception that I was getting, because people are really interested.
Yeah.
So I said, hey, okay.
Yeah.
Let's do this right.
Okay. So what is that's a great question. What is doing this right? What was your process for gathering this information?
Just reading anything I could find on the Indians. I mean, the place to start for Manchester, of course, was Matthias Spies, who turned out to be a statewide well-known historian of the Indian period. And he wrote the first history of Manchester in the celebration of the 100th anniversary in 1923. He and a guy named Bidwell. And so I started with that. And then I just kept researching and looking for more information, and the computer's a wonderful source for that.
Yeah.
One author will refer to another, and so you read that guy's book and the next one. And student papers, whatever.
So it's just a chain reaction of information almost. Yes. Interesting. So how was it received? You said that a lot of people were very interested in it. Was there information that a lot of these people hadn't heard of before? Was it new information?
Oh yeah, it's clear that they didn't have much knowledge about it. As one author said about the 100 years from the time of Columbus's discovery of the New World. To the next period, we don't know anything about it. We never studied. From Christopher Columbus to the Pilgrims, most people can't tell you what happened in that period, right?
Yeah.
And so it's all lost, and that was part of the process too. Let's pull some of that information together.
Interesting, yeah. So today we're going to talk about. I think we decided on a time frame we were going to kind of start at.
Yes.
Let's ask this first. Where did your information start for your presentations that you were doing? What time period were you starting in?
About 60,000 years ago.
About 60,000 years ago.
Yes.
Okay.
I found a book by a geneticist. And so he tells us that studying genetics, we know that humans began in Africa. And he identifies a particular location in Africa, although I just read recently they think there's more than one location.
Interesting, okay.
But the main one has been in East Africa. It's called the... It's in Africa across the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula. And so about 60,000 years ago, the humans in Africa decided maybe they ought to check in some other location. And so they did a first great migration in which they crossed the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula, and they followed the southerly coast of Asia all the way to Australia, which at the time was connected to the Asian mainland.
Wow.
And then not long thereafter, they made a second great migration, and this time they went up into the center of Asia, following Asian steppe land, which is grasslands, flat, semi-arid. And they get to the center of Asia, and portions of them take a left turn, and they go westerly, and they settle Europe 30 to 35,000 years ago. And the other group goes right, and they settle Siberia. And the geneticists can tell you that everybody that lives in the original inhabitants of the Americas came from the Siberians.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So remember, we're dealing with a period after the last ice age. And so as the ice retreated, humans were able to move into areas where they hadn't been before.
Right, yeah.
And in part because the seas were 300 feet lower than they are today. And so there was a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska.
Okay.
And the Siberians used to go back and forth hunting, and eventually as the ice retreated further, they were able to come down into North America and eventually South America, and in 1,000 years they covered that whole distance to the lowest point in South America.
Interesting. Yeah, that's one of those things you forget about, just how the geography of the land is going to play a massive role in the migration and where people have access to. Right. It's interesting.
And what land is settlable?
Yeah, well, where can we actually stop and yes. Provide life
and establish ourselves?
Yeah,
yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
So you went back 60,000 years. We're obviously for this podcast episode, we're gonna narrow it down a little bit.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you remember though in that time period from that 60,000 years ago to we're gonna go to the 1600s? I think we talked about.
Yes.
Was there anything in that time period though that was really important to you, or a piece of that you found particularly interesting? Kind of that whole migration period and development of time. That's obviously a big chunk of time. But was there anything that stood out to you that you would be remiss to not include?
So far we haven't gotten anybody to New England, so maybe we can just do that in one sentence.
Yeah.
About 10,000 years ago, as the ice started to retreat in New England about 15,000 years ago. By 10,000, the Paleo-Indian hunters who were following the retreating ice, because they were following the animals, and the animals were entering New England, and that's where their food came from. So they followed the animals, and they started to settle New England.
Wow. Okay. So that really was migration patterns with the natural order of things. Yes. Animals are moving this direction. We follow the animals because we're hunter gatherers.
Right.
That's the way we're going to go. Interesting. So we got to New England. Or say we, our predecessors got to New England from just following the natural progression of that. Wow. Okay. Yes. Interesting. So now that we're in the 1600s, what's the setting like? What are we looking at? How are people established right now? What's that look like? If we're in the 1600s.
Sure. So you would find, first of all, that the coastline, the eastern coast, was fully settled. So when you read the information left by the discoverers and the fishermen. Fishermen were big.
Oh, okay.
In coming to this country, which we pretty much know nothing about. But they were here on a regular basis. European fishermen were coming over.
Interesting.
And so, obviously they're also following what's good fishing ground.
Right. Yeah.
So you will find villages of the Native Americans ranging between 200 and 2,000 per village.
Wow.
Almost everywhere.
Wow.
Now numbers are really hard to come by. It's all guesstimate.
Yeah. Yep.
So the numbers are basically all over the place, but that one most people seem to be comfortable with.
Okay, so there's already established, for lack of a better word, societies within the Indian culture. They've got their villages, they've got they're set up on this coastline on the whole coast. Okay, yes. So when we come in, when does it start when do they start being affected by the influence of other, outsiders, for lack of a better word?
So let's start with the first European that we know about right in our territory here, and that was Adrian Block.
Okay.
Now, the Dutch present an interesting case because where the English and French came over, They were looking to settle the land.
Right.
They had other reasons to be here.
Right.
But the Dutch were strictly businessmen.
Hmm.
They were here to capture furs,
Mm-hmm.
specifically beaver.
Mm-hmm.
The Dutch were acquiring 10,000 beaver pelts a year from the Native Americans.
Wow. Okay.
And that was because the fur closest into the animal
Mm-hmm.
with the beaver is a very fine felt, or it makes a fur a very fine felt. And the Dutch were into felt hats.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, so tens of thousands of beaver
Yes,
skins to
yes,
make all
yes,
to
yes,
meet that demand
yes,
of Dutch
yes,
hats.
Yes. So they're in New Amsterdam.
Okay.
And so Adrian Block is charged with looking around the area, get out of New Amsterdam and start looking for places where the Dutch could set up
Yeah.
trading posts.
Yeah.
And the Connecticut River was, of course, an attractive spot. So
Of course.
he managed to make his way into the Connecticut. Connecticut River has always been blocked by a major sandbar.
Mm.
He managed to get over that.
Hmm.
He noticed that the water coming down the Connecticut moved faster and was fresher than most rivers,
Mm-hmm.
further upriver. And so he called it the Versha, or Fresh River.
Hmm.
And he sailed his little ship. I should tell you that his main ship, I think it burned.
Oh wow. Okay.
And he lost it in any event in New Amsterdam. And so he had built a smaller ship, and he's in this smaller ship called the Restless. And he is sailing up the Connecticut River, and he gets to the bends in Middletown. He makes a stop there, and then he comes up and he finds a relatively large tribe, the Podunks.
The Podunk. Okay.
And he finds them in South Windsor. And he on his map marks the land as Nawas. The Indians apparently called the territory Nawasha.
Okay.
And so he visits with them. He sails up to the dam at Enfield, which is as far up as he can get, and then he goes back and makes his report.
And that's his route. That's his route.
That's his route. He goes back to New Amsterdam. And so in 1631, the Dutch come up the Connecticut River again, and they buy a strip of land from the Pequots.
Okay.
We'll get to talk about them in some
Sure,
depth
yeah.
before we're done. And you remember that the Pequots were based in the Thames River Valley in what is today New London.
Mm-hmm.
But they had invaded the Connecticut River Indians, and they had established a domination over them. And so they owned the land along the Connecticut River, and the Dutch bought a strip from them in what is today Hartford.
Oh wow.
And they set up a trading post, which they called the House of Good Hope.
Wow. So the House of Good Hope was in Hartford, essentially.
Was in Hartford.
Wow.
Where the Park River comes in. You've heard of Dutch Point.
Yup, that sounds familiar.
Those are all terms dating back to that period.
Wow, that's so interesting. So
Yeah.
this became almost a hub for trade. Was that now specifically between the Dutch and the Pequot, or was that like the Dutch are here, come to this?
So we have a very interesting history coming up.
Oh, okay.
One of the things that the Dutch insisted upon with the Pequots was that the trading post should be available to all tribes, period. Don't interfere with them as they're making their way across your territory to get to our trading post.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? It didn't work out.
I was going to say, yeah.
Because there was a group, we think probably Narragansetts from Rhode Island, making their way to the Dutch trading post, and they are attacked by Pequots. Or at least the Pequots got blamed.
At least the Pequots got blamed. Okay.
And so the next time that the Pequot sachem, their chief, trades with the Dutch, they seize him. And they tell the Pequots that if they want their chief back, that they have to pay a bushel of wampum. Wampum was the currency of the day, made out of conch shells.
Okay.
And or clam shells, excuse me. And so they tell them that they got to pay the wampum, and they've got to produce the guys that killed the traders. And so the Pequots, of course, are anxious to get their leader.
Oh my God,
right?
yeah.
So they pay the wampum, and the Dutch deliver their sachem's body.
Oh no.
Which did not go over well.
Oh no.
All.
Yeah. Okay, so that had to have incited more conflict and more division at that point.
Yes, it did. It did.
Interesting.
It was kind of the first instance of this.
Okay, yeah.
Meanwhile, to keep talking about the trading post, the two English settlements in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, had been approached by one of the Podunk chieftains who wanted to get out from under the Pequots and the annual payment of tribute and the fact that they were threatening as the dominant tribe.
Right.
And so his name is recorded in history as Natawante, but Natawante in Algonquin means "come to my place," so it was a pseudonym. He wasn't using his real name.
Right, right.
And he goes to Massachusetts Bay and to Plymouth, and he says, "Come settle in the Connecticut River Valley. We're loaded with beaver, and it's rich soil, and we'll give you something like 80 bushels of corn a year, and we'll both be advantaged."
Yeah, let's get them out of here. Let's move in.
But meanwhile, the English were aware of the thing with the Pequots, and so they say, "We're not going anywhere near this," because they understand the Indian culture, which was that if you pay tribute to me, I owe you protection. So the English in Massachusetts are saying to themselves, this guy is just trying to suck us into his problems with the Pequots and get us involved in that, and we're not interested.
Yeah.
So they stay put.
Okay.
However, time goes on, and they see how well the Dutch are doing in the Connecticut River. So the first to make a move is the Plymouth colony.
Okay.
And they send a small boat up the Connecticut River, and the commander is a Lieutenant Holmes, who had military experience. He was second to the primary military guy in Plymouth Colony. And they have on board a pre-made house that they can use as a trading post.
Okay.
They've got it there in sections.
Okay.
And they sail up the river, and they get to the Dutch, and the Dutch say, "Get out of here, or we're going to fire our cannon on you."
Oh, okay.
And they say, "Well, too bad, because we're going north." And they do, and the Dutch do not fire their cannon. And they settle. They set up their trading post above the Dutch, which, of course, is the place to be because the pelts are coming down the river.
Right.
And they settle in Windsor.
Okay, yep.
Right where the Loomis Chaffee School is
Oh,
now.
wow. Okay, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
So now they start to do well. And so the Massachusetts Bay people say, "This is crazy. We got to be part of this."
Yeah, we're
This
missing
trade,
out on
you know?
this. Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
So they send a guy down who noses around what becomes Wethersfield.
Okay.
And eventually those two places, Windsor and Wethersfield, people come in to actually settle.
Okay, yeah.
And that's how those two towns get started. Wow. So, and then about the same time, so now we're up to 1636, I think.
Okay.
Don't hold me to the dates.
No, that's okay. That's fair, yeah.
And Hooker, the Reverend Hooker, comes down from one of the Massachusetts towns outside of Boston, and he brings his people with him, nearly his entire congregation, and they drive something like 100 and some odd head of cattle with them.
Oh, wow.
And they come down what's known as the Connecticut Path, which we know is Route 44.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Route 44 goes all the way to Plymouth, Mass, right?
Right, right.
And so that road followed the Indian Trail, and he comes down and he establishes Hartford. So those are your first three Connecticut towns.
Yeah, that's
Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor.
Wow, and it was all because of this beaver trading almost. It was it was following the river and trying to get the best setup for being most accessible for that trade.
Right.
Interesting. So the Dutch settled in kind of in Hartford, but didn't really establish Hartford. Then it was the French in Massachusetts, to recap?
No. Massachusetts was English.
English.
Yeah.
The English came down.
The French are Canada.
Canada. Got it.
St. Lawrence Valley.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the English come down, and then finally, so we establish all those first three towns just over trade. So what did this do? So what did this do for the Pequots? Was there any issue with these new towns being established and the Pequots being the dominant Indian force at that point. Did this ruffle any feathers, so to speak?
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
so
within about 3 years, we're at war.
okay, there it is. Okay, so is that specifically with the Pequots, or is that with?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what did that look like? How did that, was that initial, did it start with taking of the chieftain? Was that kind of the ignition for that like conflict essentially?
Yeah. So what happens next is that there is an English trader that everybody hates, and they expel him from the two Massachusetts locations. So he's on his way south, probably to Virginia, because he's been told, get out of here or you're done.
Yeah.
And he stops in the Connecticut River, and he seizes 2 Indians from the Western Niantic tribe, which was a sub-tribe of the Pequots. And he wants them the next day to guide him up the river, the Connecticut River. And instead what happens is a group of Western Niantics kill this trader and his crew. And now the English are upset because they're not going to tolerate Indians killing English settlers, even though we hate the guy. And
we exiled him,
And the Pequots get blamed for that. So that triggers what came next. But the story gets really complicated. So
okay.
Let me introduce another element.
Yeah.
Okay. So the people in Wethersfield, that settled Wethersfield, buy land from the Wangunk tribe.
Okay.
And its sachem. And so the deal as far as the Wangunk sachem is concerned was, I'm going to sell you the land, and you're going to let me be nearby with my tribe, and that way I'm going to get protection from you. Well, guess what? The Wethersfield settlers didn't want anything to do with him or his tribe, and so they told him to get out of there. Now he's mad. And so he arranges for an attack on Wethersfield with the Pequots, by the Wangunks and the Pequots. And they attack Wethersfield settlers who are working in their fields. They kill 9 of them. They take 2 young women captive, and they sail them down the river. And now everybody's in an uproar. And so the English settlers on the Connecticut River are saying, all right, this is stopping right here. Now, and that's how the Pequot War gets started.
Wow. They attacked Wethersfield, took captives, and that was the point where the settlers were like, nope, we have to stand up, we have to tell them, we have to take the land that we were bought from them or whatever.
Right.
Interesting. So how long did the Pequot Wars go on for, approximately?
I think it was 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
And then, so was there a final settlement with that? Was there a final kind of, end conflict?
Yes. The Pequots tribes destroyed, effectively destroyed. But there's a key element to this that we also need to know and have entered the conversation. And that is that the Europeans who arrived on this continent had domesticated animals for centuries. And because they lived close to their animals, they got diseases from their animals. It's not unlike the discussion we've had about where COVID came from.
Right.
Did it come from, the wet markets in China or the lab? So we're interested in the theory about the wet markets because it shows that there's a crossover. You can catch diseases from the animals.
Right.
All right. So what happens when the Europeans have their animals living close to them, they develop immunities. Well, guess who had no immunities for a multitude of diseases that the Europeans brought with them?
Yeah,
the Native Americans.
Yep.
And when these diseases would hit, and they would come one after another, 80 to 90% of a tribe would be wiped out.
Wow.
Where the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth had been several years before a thriving Indian village. So many Indians died in that village, there was nobody left to bury the corpses.
Wow. And it's just from the disease.
Just from diseases.
Wow.
Well, even chickenpox.
Yeah.
The first big epidemic that hit the coast they think was chickenpox. From Cape Cod to Penobscot Bay.
Wow. And just killing.
Wiped out Indians.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, that's You know, because you think it's war. You know, you think it's just the war, and we're going through, we're taking out a village. But a lot of it, I'm sure most of that was just new and infectious diseases.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
crazy.
Yes. Yes.
So the Pequots were essentially wiped out after a couple of years.
Yes.
Because of these wars.
So let's drill down just a little bit before we leave
Sure,
the subject of the
sure.
Pequot War. So there was a guy by the name of John Mason who also had military experience in Europe, and he was one of the settlers in Windsor.
Okay.
And so once the Connecticut settlements determined that they were going to make war on the Pequots, they put Mason in charge. So at the time, there were about 250 people living in those three settlements on the Connecticut River. They put together 90 soldiers under Mason's command. He sails down the river to Fort Saybrook. There was a fort there that was also English.
Okay.
And he's joined in that effort by Indians from the Podunks. Under the command of Uncas, who was the chief sachem of the Mohegan tribe, which is north of the Pequots on the Thames River.
Okay.
In the general area of Norwich today.
Okay.
As they are now.
Okay,
right?
yeah,
They're still there. And the Pequots are in Mashantucket. So anyway, so they have these Indian allies. Why the Mohegans? Because Uncas, after the Dutch had killed the chief sachem of the tribe, Uncas vied to be his successor, and he was passed over by Sassacus. And so Uncas, after several attempts, at one point he comes to the Connecticut River and he hides in East Windsor, which was a subtribe of the Podunks. And at that point, lo and behold, he befriends John Mason. They know each other. So that's why he makes his warriors available to assist Mason in this effort to attack the Pequots. And he has this personal reason why he wants to eliminate the Pequots as
yeah. So there was a little bit of tribe on tribe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
A lot of that.
Yeah.
Because remember, these tribes had been vying with one another for authority for 1,000 years or more before the Europeans show up.
Right.
So you're going to see the Europeans as potential allies.
Yeah. Because they don't know. They don't. Yeah. They're like.
Yeah.
Hey, we can.
They don't know how this is going to play out.
But they know that the Pequots have the most land right now, and that's what they want to stop.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So John Mason gets to Old Saybrook. Now his orders are to attack the main Pequot fort, which is on the hill overlooking New London.
Okay.
In Groton.
Okay.
And but he decides that it would be smarter because the Indians are going to expect him there, to sail to Mystic, where they have another major fort. Actually, no, he goes beyond that. He goes to the Narragansett Bay. And in so doing, he picks up several hundred Narragansett Indians who also don't like the Pequots as additional soldiers for him.
Wow, yeah.
And they march under cover of night to Mystic, Connecticut, where this major village of 600 to 800 Pequots, mostly women and children, are in this fort. Let me describe the forts for you. The forts were circular palisades, large trees stuck in the ground. And to enter, you had to pass through an overlap of the sides of the circle that only one person could get through at a time.
Oh, wow, okay.
And they had this major village in Mystic, and they had two of those entryways. So John Mason and his warriors and his troops attack in the early morning hours. And the idea is to get them to surrender. but the Pequots fight back hard. And so Mason decides that he has no choice but to burn the village. And that's the whole story of the Pequot massacre, where 600 to 800 died in something like an hour.
Wow.
Major conflagration.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, the Narragansetts were very upset with this because we think of the Indians as savages. And so when we think of them fighting, we think, it's Custer again. It's Custer again, cutting scalps and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But Roger Williams, who settled Providence, Rhode Island, tells us that Indian fighting was more theater. There wasn't a lot of death. European fighting was a horse of a very different color.
Yeah.
We were very violent.
Yes. Win by any means necessary. Yes. Lighting it on fire. And
so when the Narragansetts saw that, they said, "No, this stop it. This is not right."
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like a value of life, that we didn't have, that the settlers didn't necessarily have. They didn't have that, that understanding of the because to double back on what we were talking about, at the very beginning, they were following the animals. They were following the natural progression of life and the movement of weather and everything. And then you've got these people where it's like, I'm going to go up the river where it's hardest to get up the river and settle here and force myself into this place and force my trade. There's a lot of force, with the settlers, whereas the Native Americans flowed naturally with the earth, So that's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, keep in mind that the European settlers who came, remember, they were the Puritans, right?
The Puritans, correct.
See, these are very religious people. And when things go well, they're convinced that they are God's anointed and that God is looking up for their safety. And they see the Indians as backward savages. And so you have this conflict. You also have a conflict over land and how land is treated. For the Indians, land was a resource the same as the water and air. You don't own those. You use those, but you do not own them. For the Europeans, land was a commodity. You owned it. So if I owned a piece of land as a European, even if I didn't do anything with it, if it was vacant, I still owned it.
Yeah.
With the Indians, if the tribe and land was considered to be tribal land.
Yeah.
You were given enough land for your sub-village or your family, and as long as you used it, fine. It was yours to use.
Yeah.
And if you stopped using it, then somebody else could come along.
Right. Yeah.
And neither side was really communicating with each other. So, as far as the Europeans were concerned, I paid you money for this thing. This is mine.
Yeah, you don't get to don't cross it, don't touch it.
And as far as the Indians were concerned, no.
No one's using it.
You didn't give us full value for this land. That's right. You get to use it.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, but we get to use it too.
Yeah, I mean, it's unoccupied. Yes, we sold you that, but you're not here. You're not using. There's no tents here. There's no. Yeah, interesting. Right. Yeah, that's and I feel like that miscommunication, for lack of a better word, but that difference in culture, was prevalent throughout. Interacting with Native Americans. The entire time of like, no, like we don't do things that, and it kind of goes back to that whole idea where the settlers are like, no, we're doing it our way, even though you've been here for 10,000 years doing it this way. Yeah. That's not how it's going to happen anymore. Right. This is the welcome to the new world.
And we have God on our side.
Yeah, we do. We have God on our side, and God is protecting us too. Yeah. Right. Wow, interesting. So we to continue that timeline. So Pequot Wars have ended. This great tragedy has happened.
Yeah, and the Europeans did everything they could to destroy the tribe. In that they sold warriors into the Caribbean slave trade. They took Pequots into their own homes as domestics, another form of slavery, if you will. And our General Assembly passed a law that said the Pequot name could not be used.
Wow.
So
Just wiping it from existence.
Did everything we could. Yeah.
Wow.
Didn't work.
Didn't work.
No,
Good.
because we have Pequots today, don't we?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So was there after the Pequot, what was it like? What was the like the climate, like, you know, the social cultural climate after that conflict? Like, were tensions high at that point now?
Less so as between Europeans in the Connecticut River Valley and Indians.
Okay.
But our story continues.
Yeah.
Now we have the Narragansetts,
Mm-hmm.
who have been vying with the Pequots as the largest and most successful tribe trading with the Europeans. And so now that the Pequots are gone,
Mm-hmm.
Uncas is interested in taking over the Pequot land,
Mm-hmm.
but so are the Narragansetts, because you
Mm-hmm.
get that whole eastern portion of Connecticut that's
Right.
now vacant, should we say.
So we have the Mohegans and the Narragansetts.
Yeah.
Okay.
And by the way, we also have Massachusetts and Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Connecticut provided the vast majority of the soldiers in the defeat of the Pequot, the Bay Colony had sent soldiers down.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as far as they were concerned, the Connecticut started this war because they were stupid.
Mm-hmm.
We sent our people, we saved them, so we have a claim.
We have a claim, of course.
Because there's no state boundaries at this point, right?
Right, right.
So Massachusetts is claiming Eastern Connecticut the same as Connecticut is claiming Eastern Connecticut.
Yeah.
So the next 40 years between the big Indian Wars, Pequot and King Philip's War, they're 40 years apart,
Mm-hmm.
is the battle between the Narragansetts
Hmm.
and the Pequots as to who's going to be the dominant tribe in this area.
Hmm.
So there comes a time when the Narragansetts gather 600 warriors,
Mm-hmm.
and they leave their domain in Rhode Island,
Mm-hmm.
and they cross the Shetucket River in Norwich,
Mm-hmm.
and they are going to attack the main village of the Mohegans in Shantuck on the Thames River. So they're going to come through Norwich, and then they're going to go down the west side of the rivers, the Thames River, and they're going to make their attack. Well, Uncas was no dummy.
Mm-hmm.
He expected this, and so there's this this hill that overlooks the city of Norwich. I think it's, and don't hold me to my pronunciation, but I think it's Wawekis Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And he has guys up there, warriors up there that are looking for this,
Mm-hmm. Getting ready.
and they see the Narragansetts coming, and so they managed to get word south of Norwich, where Shantuck is, and they get word to Uncas. So Uncas is a pretty clever guy, and so they meet for battle on the grounds of what is today Three Rivers Community College.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And it's like a small valley.
Yeah.
And so Uncas approaches the sachem of the Narragansetts, Bicentennial, and suggests that instead of having warriors die, that they have an individual battle, and the winner takes all. And Bicentennial has 600 warriors, and Uncas has maybe 300 or 400 warriors. So Bicentennial doesn't consider this to be a good deal, and he rejects it. At which point, Uncas, by prearrangement, falls on the ground. And that is the signal to his warriors, who are ready with their arms to fire their arrows and attack. Whereas the Narragansetts had been just kind of lounging around, waiting for the sachems to decide what was going to happen. And so they get routed, and they get driven up the Thames River back to Norwich and across Norwich. And Bicentennial is captured.
Wow.
And the spot where he's captured now has a big granite monument on it that was put there in the 1840s. And the reason he gets captured is because an English friend of his in Rhode Island had given him this heavy corselet, which was heavy enough to block an arrow, but it weighted him down. And as they're scrambling to get back across the Chautauqua River and Rhode Island, he gets caught.
Wow.
So, after the Pequot War in 1638, the English in Hartford, representing all the English in the Connecticut River Valley, had forced the Narragansetts and the Mohegans to take any issues they had between themselves to the English for ultimate disposition.
Interesting. Okay.
So, having captured his rival, Uncas delivers Miantonoma to the English in Hartford. And they decide that they're just going to have trouble with Indians as long as these two are around, and the best thing to do is to let Uncas kill Miantonoma. However, the English don't want any blood on their hands.
Right.
So they do send some men as monitors along with the warriors from the Mohegans to take Miantonoma back out of the English territory, because they say you can kill him, but you can't kill him on our territory.
Right. Okay.
And so they kill him at the earliest opportunity. And Matthias Spiess, who I talked about earlier, who wrote that 100th anniversary volume of the History of Manchester, says he believes that killing took place in Bolton Notch.
Oh, wow.
Because that was the edge of the English territory vis-a-vis the Indian territory. And they would have dispatched him. They killed him with a hatchet to the back of the head.
Wow.
At the earliest opportunity.
Wow. Yeah, that's so interesting.
So you got all this stuff going on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's interesting that the English, too, are both don't want anything
like
to do with it.
Like Pontius Pilate, right?
Yeah, but also say, no, come to us for all. It's like we want to control what's going on here,
yes,
but we also want nothing to do with it, which is so, what a crazy, wow, that's, interesting. Okay. So this Mohegan, so now, are the Mohegans now the prominent, tribe?
Yes, but interestingly enough, Uncas has ceded all of his tribal land except the land that is occupied by his tribal members at the time. This is 1638, I believe, right after the Pequot War. He cedes the rest of his territory to the English. So I get because he has a good relationship with the English. They're going to protect him from any further issues he might have.
So now they own the land. The English own the land that the Mohegans. Was it except for that one area where his tribe was currently?
Well, anywhere in that large area where they were occupying, they were okay. Wow. And the English didn't rush in with settlers. I mean, it was more or less open land.
Okay, but still, but now, in the English's eyes at least, that's our land. Yeah, that was given to us by the Native Americans.
Yes.
Interesting. Yep. Okay, so now you had brought up so during. There's another conflict, you said, the King Philip's War. Was that correct?
Yes.
So was there any, in that 40-year span, was there any in particular important kind of prerequisites for that war? Like what happened to lead to that?
There was a tribe called the Wampanoags.
Okay.
And they were in Massachusetts on the opposite side of Narragansett Bay. So you've got the Narragansetts on our side, if you will, of the bay in Rhode Island, and you got the Wampanoags, and they also cover the Nauset tribe on Cape Cod was one of their sub-tribes, and they covered that area where approaching Boston and all. Okay, so their sachem is Chief Massasoit, and that's his title. His real name is Yellow Feather, but his title is as Chief Sachem is Massasoit, and he saves the Pilgrims. He dies at the ripe old age of 81.
Oh wow!
In 1661.
Wow.
And he is succeeded in his chief sachemship by first his elder son Alexander, who dies of an illness fairly quickly thereafter, and he is succeeded by his son, who takes the English name Philip. His Indian name is Metacom. And Philip has figured out that things are not going well for the Native Americans, that more and more of their land is being taken over by the English, and they're domineering, and they're a problem. And so he makes war.
Oh, okay.
And now we have yet another war. And the Indians they have to choose sides, and some Indians go with Philip, and some Indians support the English. And interestingly enough, the Connecticut River Indians had always been friendly, but the Podunks throw their lot in with Philip. And so you have this tremendous war that takes place, and when it's over, we'll jump ahead just to the ending. 25 English towns, more than half of the colonist settlements in New England, lay in ruins.
Wow.
And the line of English habitation was pushed back almost to the coast. 600 English were dead, 1,200 houses burned, 8,000 head of cattle killed. The English king's agent estimated that some 3,000 Indians lost their lives. Many of the surviving Wampanoags were sold in the slave markets of the West Indies and Spain.
Wow.
So the truth of the matter is that the English were almost expelled from New England.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Indians were devastated.
Yeah. That's just comparing that to the previous conflict. I mean, that is a significant change in destruction and death.
Yes.
That is a much more significant. Yeah.
And yet it hardly touched Connecticut, interestingly enough.
Wow.
We sent our troops elsewhere. Major fighting was in Massachusetts and to a lesser extent, but significantly in Rhode Island. The Narragansetts get attacked.
Wow.
And they get devastated.
Wow.
They get totally wiped out. Because again, we still have Narragansetts, but yeah, they got beat up pretty bad.
Wow. So King Philip started this. So Philip started this war, but it almost annihilated most of the Native Americans in this area.
Yes.
Wow. So what was the repercussion of that? Did Philip? I'm assuming. Did Philip die during this conflict? I'm assuming he did.
He did.
Okay. And what was the aftermath for the Native American? Like, where was it basically scattered to the wind essentially?
Yeah.
Wow.
There's a if I can find it here, a Frenchman who visited the region a decade after the war wrote, "There is nothing to fear from the savages, for they are few in number.
Wow.
The last wars they had with the English have reduced them to a small number, and consequently they are incapable of defending themselves."
Wow.
And guess what happened to the Podunks?
What happened to the Podunks?
Same thing.
Wow.
Same thing. There are only stragglers left after King Philip's War. There are Podunks around, but they are few and far between.
So Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island becomes almost
European.
European, almost Native American free, if not just for.
Yes.
Did they when they were were they living amongst the were they still out kind of in their own small little tribe, like tiny villages kind of thing?
Yeah, small.
Wow.
And on reservations.
On reservations.
Mashantucket.
Okay.
Is a reservation.
And that was established by the Europeans.
Yes.
Was to be, hey, this is their spot.
We're going to corral you here. At one point, they had the Mashantucket Pequots on Noank, which is just a big rock.
Oh wow!
So how do you survive? How do you plant and survive in Noank?
Wow!
And eventually they ended up in.
So it was basically internment camps in a way, for lack of a better word, without the structures there.
Yes.
But hey, you are stay in this corner. Wow. So now, what time frame is this now? After King Philip's War ended, approximately
1670s.
1670s.
Yeah.
So now, what is English trade looking like? Are they just basically who are they trading with at this point? Is it now a they're just amongst themselves sort of thing? Because
Well,
before they were getting all these beaver pelts from the
yes,
Native Americans.
yes,
Did
yes.
they just take over that trade? Did they just take over that whole operation?
No, you know what changed that?
What?
What people chose to wear.
Are you kidding? Wow.
The beaver hats were no longer in vogue.
Wow. Wow. That's astonishing. And also believable because that's how things go, I feel like, back then. That's crazy. That's insane.
But we had tremendous fishing grounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, that's where their trade was.
So fishing
with
boomed,
Europe.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Is there any backlash, or is there, from the surrounding, because I know a lot of tribes moved west. Yeah. A lot of people moved west. There's obviously
more north from here.
Yeah.
You ended up in New York.
Okay.
Eventually. Yeah, and of course you have the Iroquois.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they made homes, I think, for in their general area for Indians that left here.
So maybe a lot of those any Mohegans or Podunk or
well, the Mohegans were allies. They were allowed to do their thing.
They were fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what happens after? So what's happening after this? What is the next big thing that kind of what happens in this area?
Well, I mean, we're interested in Manchester, right?
Yeah.
So let's go way back now.
Yeah.
Let's
go.
We're getting a little bit out of sync.
That's okay. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go way back. So, at some point, the authorities in Hartford authorized a purchase of 3 miles of 3 miles of width of land on the east side of the river. Remember, the settlements were all on the west side of the river. So now they buy 3 miles width of land from the Podunks.
Okay.
And that becomes East Hartford.
Okay.
Manchester is called the Wilderness. Manchester was never more than hunting territory for the Podunks. The Podunks had their main villages. They had one in East Hartford and one in South Windsor.
Okay.
And then they had some smaller groups that were in East Windsor.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually, however, the English settlements are growing, and there's a desire for more land.
Mm-hmm.
And so at some point, they make arrangements to buy additional land from now the Mohegans. The Mohegans are the tribal authority.
Right.
And so they buy from the Mohegans a 5 miles square parcel of land that becomes Manchester 150
in that
years,
wilderness.
150 years later. Yeah.
Wow.
The wilderness is Manchester.
Wow. So the Podunk tribe was essentially they were in that area.
Yeah, there had been some intermarriages, and so the Mohegan sachems married into what's left of the Podunk leadership, and so the Podunk tribe became a sub-tribe of the Mohegans.
Interesting.
Yeah, of what was left of it.
Of what was left. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. So Manchester, as far as during the time where Native Americans were the predominant group, they were the ruling group of this land. The Podunks essentially owned the Manchester area as it was their hunting grounds. It wasn't even they didn't even live there. It was essentially where they would go just to get. Wow.
Yes. Well, they had villages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because they tended to move a couple of times a year.
Mm-hmm.
So in the summertime, they would be near the Connecticut River.
Mm-hmm.
And there were numerous reasons for that. One was that the ground was rich.
Mm-hmm.
And it was plowable as opposed to the stony uplands.
Absolutely.
It was more importantly, it was much more temperate. There was a less period of time when you were subject to frost.
Okay.
And they were planters, and so their crops grew better if they were near the river. In the meanwhile, however, the game, when they were hunting, and you tended to hunt in the fall when the deer in particular were bigger, and you could find them because they left their tracks in the snow. You hunted in the fall and early winter, and so you'd move into the hunting areas.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So okay, that's really good to know because It's crazy knowing King Philip's War. That is something that I wasn't even familiar with personally, and that's an embarrassment for me.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that really was the almost like the final situation to, at least in our, in the Northeast, in our area, that seemed to be the final.
Yeah, it's clearly in southern New England.
Yeah,
it was dispositive. Now we haven't tried to name all the tribes.
Right.
We could do that, but we haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
For example, there's a tribe called the Nipmucs that are based in central Massachusetts, but their territory came down into Connecticut. So, for example, what is it called? Shinipset Lake now, I think, in Rockville.
Okay.
That was their boundary, came that far down.
Wow.
So it's pretty close.
Yeah.
And also, so portions of Talland and Windham counties were part of Nipmuc territory.
Wow. So yeah, there was many, not just the three main ones we kind of talked about.
Yeah.
There's different smaller tribes just scattered throughout.
Multiple tribes in Connecticut.
And so when King Philip's War happened, is it to be assumed that most of these tribes took a side, essentially? Like was there any tribes that were kind of left out of the conflict?
No, the Nipmucs were on Philip's side.
They were on Philip's side, yeah. Man.
And the Narragansetts were.
Yeah.
Not right from the start, but eventually they were.
Wow.
Yeah. And the Europeans brought some of that on themselves by being belligerent.
Yeah.
They were untrusting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And Uncas was a very capable leader, but he was a conniver.
Yeah, that whole story. Uncas was the one who dropped down, right? That
yes.
Was, yeah. That is a very tactful.
But he was always trying to stir things up if it was to his advantage.
Interesting. Yeah. That seemed to be a learned behavior for most of the Native Americans, because it was you've got to control most of the land, so you've got to do. We look at the comparison to the Europeans. You had talked about before how the Europeans have a scorched earth mentality when it came to fighting almost, whereas it was, you said, theatrical almost for the Native Americans. But it's almost like Uncas maybe even developed, maybe with his closeness with the Europeans, developed these tactics or learned these tactics, was learning how to be conniving, was learning how to take the way that they took, almost, at least from my very, very brief understanding of it. But it sounds like the closer that they got to the Europeans, the more conniving and the more self-preservation overtook.
Yeah, that may be something of an overstatement.
It could be.
And maybe conniver was a little harsh, but because he was certainly
he cared about his people. He was doing what was right for his tribe.
Yes. Yes. And one of the arguments that the historians make when they're comparing intelligence, obviously the Europeans looked down on the Indians and said, they're just a bunch of savages and they don't have Christianity and whatever.
So they must be unintelligent.
Yeah. But they were very intelligent.
Oh yeah.
And one example of that is food. 4/7 of the value of agricultural products in this nation today come from plants that were hybridized by the Indians, and the Indians taught the white people how to use these things.
Wow.
A major one being corn.
Yeah.
Corn is not a naturally growing plant. It was hybridized. Over centuries and centuries.
Because the Native Americans started that.
Yeah. And they planted corn, beans, and squash together. You've probably read of that, the so-called Three Sisters. And what we know now, the Indians were not scientists, but they learned from doing, and they learned from observing what worked.
It's a scientific process.
And so they ate much better than the Europeans did. They lived longer than the Europeans. They were far healthier than the Europeans.
Yeah.
The guys who brought all these diseases.
Yeah.
I mean, they had all kinds of other issues.
Yeah.
And they talk about Indian runners being able to run 100 miles in a day, and the second day thereafter, run the same 100 miles back in the same time.
Wow. That's incredible. And it's amazing it's that natural, it's the tapped into nature. It is that natural, that thousands of years, that those 60,000 years, that 10,000 years of experience, and also handed down traditions. I'm sure that was within. I'm sure tribes also had specific things that they were, skilled at, as opposed to, in this area we're the best beaver hunters because we've spent years learning how they move, where they go, where they hibernate, where this happens. Yeah. And European, we come.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And as getting back to the intelligence aspect, this historian that I was reading says, remember, they held their own. Strategically, they held their own. They were very competent sachems in the tribes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like everybody, that is a common theme in the history of, I will say European settlers, but from what I understand of my limited view of history, that seems to be the trend of, we are the smarter, better being because what X, Y, and Z, whatever, because we have God, because we're white, because we're this, because we're that, and has time and time again, as we look back in history, we are learning from the people that were expected to be less intelligent, that were expected to be savages.
The Europeans who were present at the time say they were tremendous hunters and tremendous fishermen.
Yeah.
Without the tools that the Europeans had.
Yeah.
They figured things out for themselves.
Yeah. And they did. Yeah. And even with all of these tools the Europeans brought over, I'm sure the Native Americans were still better at still better hunters, still better fishers.
I'm sure.
Even with, that's amazing. Yeah. And I think it's a testament to tradition, and a testament to listening to the earth, listening again. I'm bringing it back to that, because that's what you speaking about the tide, the oceans being lower, and the ice melting away, and following where the animals were going, that doesn't happen anymore. Obviously we've got, we have a lot has changed since then, but that knowledge, that skill set only comes from survival. That only comes from years and years of training your people and your tribe and passing this information down. That's integral to the survival of a culture, So I want to say thank you as well for being part of that contribution, in a way, at least for us, at least in Manchester, at least for this podcast, to give some of that insight into the past, because I don't think I can speak for myself. I won't speak for, the audience, but this is a lot of new information for me that I was not aware of. And it's incredibly important, knowing where we came from, knowing what was here before us, knowing how we've established ourselves, not erasing history, is incredibly important, and it's valuable to get this information and to learn this stuff. So thank you, Steve, for taking the time to research this and spend some of your life to better understanding that stuff. Honestly, genuinely. Yeah. Is there anything else, before we kind of wrap up, was there anything else that you found particularly important, or something that you wanted to touch on at all?
Well, we didn't make much of an effort to identify the tribes. I don't know to what extent.
If you want, I'd love to do that real quick if you'd like. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay.
I think that'd be very important.
So do you want to talk in terms of southern New England, or do you want to talk in terms of Connecticut, or both?
I think that if you want to do I say whatever you want to do. You're the expert. You're my expert here, at least in my eyes.
Okay. All right. So let's start in Fairfield County. There's a tribe called the Siwanags that was in Fairfield County. And their name is related to shells, seashells. You're going to find that names of tribes and names of places with the Algonquins is always descriptive. Now, the Siwanags were part of the confederacy that occupied Manhattan Island and the lower Hudson Valley. Another tribe in that confederacy was the Mohicans, whom James Fenimore Cooper, in his book The Last of the Mohicans, called Mohicans. So that's the first tribe we're going to talk about. In the Bridgeport area were the Paugussets. Sometimes you'll hear that name. In the New Haven area were the Quinnipiacs. And the Quinnipiac name comes from the fact that there was a trail that went along the shoreline, and at the main village of the Quinnipiacs, it made a turn and went south towards New Haven. And Quinnipiac is an Algonquin term for a turning. The next tribe, we're going to skip over the Connecticut River for a minute because we're going to, the next tribe is the Hamonassets. You've heard of the Hamonasset. And then we're going to skip over the Connecticut River because we are going to come back to it and do the river tribes.
Sure.
So beyond the Connecticut River, we have the Western Niantics. We mentioned them, I think, in our conversation.
I think we did, yeah.
Yeah, because they killed the trader that was headed for Virginia.
Yep.
And beyond them, we have the Thames River tribes. We've mentioned the Pequots, who were in the New London area, and then, as they are today, we have the Mohegans that are north of them on the Thames River. Beyond that, we have the Niantics, which are in Rhode Island, followed by the Narragansetts, both of them on our side of the Narragansett Bay, and then I went beyond the state line.
That's okay.
Yep. So if we're going to keep covering Connecticut Indians, I've mentioned the Nipmucks, we have the Podunks in our area, we have the Agawams, Agawam, Massachusetts, who were a sub-tribe of the Pecumtucks on the Connecticut River in Massachusetts. We have the Massaukos, who were in Simsbury, the Tunxus in Farmington, and interestingly enough, northwestern Connecticut, Litchfield County, had no tribes. And the reason it had no tribes is because it was hunting territory for the Mohawks.
Oh.
And nobody messed with the Mohawks.
Right. Wow.
In fact, the Mohawks used to send their tax collectors to collect the tribute from the river tribes in addition to the Pequots.
Wow.
They were the two dominant tribes of our Connecticut people.
Wow.
We've already talked about the Wampanoags. The tribe that was in the Boston area was the Massachusetts, people of the Great Blue Hill. And I think we've covered.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's important to get all. I'm glad we took a second to get all those out there.
But we haven't done some of the river tribes, I think, or maybe we did. Yeah, I think we pretty much did. Yep, we did.
Well, that's good coverage then. I'm glad that we're able to get all that. Thank you for doing that. And again, Steve, thank you again for putting this all together.
Okay.
It's been incredibly helpful. It's been incredibly informative. Again, is there anything else that we were able to do that? Is there anything else?
Nope.
Well, then perfect. Well,
I'm sure we'll get calls someday about why didn't you talk about this or why didn't you talk about that. But well, we've done what we could, right?
To let everybody know, Steve has also put I have put you in a box as far as what content we talk about. Steve has done extensive research. You had a almost 2-hour or 3-hour presentation that you've been doing on it. So if there is calls or messages, Steve has done a lot more research than this. So just for your sake, but thank you for being able to condense it down so we can just give a brief history.
My pleasure.
For the people listening. It's been a pleasure having you on here. It's going to be perfect for us. So thank you so much, Steve.
Okay.
Thank you everybody for watching. We'll talk to you guys on the next episode and have a good one.